Wow, did you guys hear about this? Payday 2 is losing its native Linux client. This comes after 7 years of official support from the developers, and many folks are up in arms over this decision. As Linux gamers, we should not just want, but demand native Linux games, right? And you might think it makes sense. The Steam Deck is running Linux, therefore we should want to have Linux game clients running on our favorite PC handhelds. Plus, Proton is a translation layer. I don't want my games translated, I want them native. Okay, honestly, that was a bit ham-fisted. Let's try to have a reasonable, level-headed conversation about why native Linux versions for games are not only unnecessary, but in many cases even undesirable. So here are 4 reasons why Linux versions of games just don't make sense today. So first, let's establish what we're even talking about. What does native actually mean? Well, this is where things get a little confusing because typically when you're talking about native versus non-native in a computing sense, you're talking about the assembly instructions of the CPU. What binary language does your processor speak? And this boils down to what instruction set your CPU uses, if it's little endian or big endian, on and on. With an x86 64-bit machine, which all modern desktops and most laptops are, it doesn't matter if it's a Windows or a Linux app, all apps are native to PC. Your CPU understands the assembly instructions that the application was compiled into, x86. So broadly speaking, if a game is on Steam, it's already native to your computer. But the catch is what OS environment the application depends on. Now, I've outlined how Proton works in previous videos, but I have to take a second to give a brief overview of this because it's important and it's relevant to what we're talking about today. Windows provides a software environment for applications to take advantage of. Things like low-level system calls to the kernel, reading from and writing to the file system, allocating RAM, multitasking, utilizing the graphics card, and so on. So when people say Linux native, they're referring to the fact that the game or application is written to use Linux interfaces rather than Windows interfaces. And that's fine, but the term native is really confusing here, at least from my perspective. It's not like Proton is an emulator and has to dynamically recompile assembly code from ARM or PowerPC to x86 or anything like that. Instead, Proton provides a mostly complete and low-level Windows-like environment for Linux operating systems. For the most part, Windows system calls through Proton are just being redirected to their Linux counterparts with virtually zero overhead. Granted, sometimes there are subtle or even substantial differences between what a Linux interface provides and what Windows applications expect to receive, and that's where the translation part comes in. But it's a pretty incredible and seamless feat when you think about it, and for the majority of games on Steam, it just works. But this brings us to the issue at hand. The first thing is workload. Now, game developers have an enormous task ahead of them. I should know, my company has had a game in development for years. Developers not only have to establish the rules, create the art, and build a working version of a game, but they also have to port it to multiple platforms. You know, you start with PC and maybe Mac, and then you port it to the Switch, Xbox, and PlayStation, but then there's also smartphones. They've got to ensure that all of these disparate versions remain up to date, compatible with each other, and they have the latest changes intact. And this can honestly feel like a Sisyphean task. With that enormous workload, it's no wonder that adding yet another platform can be out of the question for many developers. Then factor in that many of the most common tools for developers out there include minimal support for Linux, especially in the AAA space, if any at all, and it makes the cost versus benefit analysis even less appealing. And that brings me to my next point, developer inexperience. While Linux is the de facto standard in the computing world, when it comes to the desktop PC, it's still fairly niche. While there's approximately 3 million monthly active Linux users on Steam, that accounts for about 1.4% of the overall Steam user base. And among game developers, when searching for talent, that translates to a small percentage of folks who actually know a thing or two about desktop Linux software development. All of this is to say that while most game developers are familiar with Windows and development kits for major consoles and perhaps even Mac, it's a rare breed that knows anything at all about Linux. This means that your average game developer is unfamiliar with Linux system APIs, they don't know how to optimize their games for Linux, or at least are not anywhere near as familiar as optimizing games for Windows, and they're not going to work as efficiently during the porting process. There's also other economic shenanigans going on too, because honestly, if you know enough about Linux that you could develop a game for it, you could probably be making a lot more money in some other IT related field. And that means that studios, which are often strapped for cash, can't afford to pay for talented Linux devs. That's not to say that there exists no Linux talent in the gaming industry. There are many teams that have talented and knowledgeable Linux staff members. But it's definitely the exception and not the rule today. Now let me ask you a question. Are you enjoying this video? Why not like that smash button? It makes a huge difference. You can also subscribe to keep up to date with the latest news and opinions we've got going on here. I want to give a special shout out to Dave Lago, one of an elite crew of patrons pledging at the highest tier. It's because of folks like Dave that I'm able to continue making this show and keeping it growing. If you believe in the work that I'm doing, you can pledge your monthly support with the link below to Patreon, and thank you. Now, we've already touched on how Proton translates Windows system calls into Linux, but graphics languages like OpenGL and Vulkan are universal between Linux and Windows. This means that they don't actually need to be translated, and that's great as many games use Vulkan today. However, let's be honest, many others don't. The fact is, writing a rendering backend is no simple task. Games that were built exclusively for DirectX are basically locked into Windows, which is the whole point of DirectX, but that's another video. If a dev wants to make their game available for Linux today, they only have two options. Either rewrite their backend using Vulkan, which is not a profitable thing to do on the face of it, or alternatively, they could choose to target Proton. Now, the nice thing about Proton, though, is that games that use DirectX are often more performant with Proton than they are under Windows. Real DirectX operations, especially D3D11 and older, are notoriously slow and bloated. So translating DirectX calls to Vulkan can often result in notable performance gains. But that is only part of the story. Proton provides an open source Windows-like environment that gives Valve far more control over the operating system. So when a game makes a Windows system call, Valve can optimize those requests. There are many great examples of this too. Red Dead Redemption 2, Elden Ring, Doom Eternal, and many others. So really, Proton provides a Windows-like environment, but critically, it's one that is optimized for gaming and the unique and demanding nature of video games. So we've covered the advantages of Proton so far, but there's actually some drawbacks to native Linux clients, at least today. Now, this wouldn't be my channel without talking about retro games and backwards compatibility. We've already talked about the additional development burden that comes with a Linux client, but what about the longevity of a release? Now, I've been making these videos for over 8 years at this point. Over that time, I've acquired several games that used to work on Linux, but no longer do. They're incompatible with modern Linux systems. And yes, there is the Steam Linux runtime, but even that isn't perfect. See, the maintainers of Linux operating systems are not particularly sentimental when it comes to legacy software. As an example, just a few years ago, Ubuntu decided to remove 32-bit software support from their distribution because pretty much everyone has been using 64-bit machines for something like 20 years. But this removal of 32-bit software support meant that older software, meaning games, really wouldn't be easy to run, if at all. The truth of the matter is that, like I said, Linux is all about progress. So running games compiled from 20 or even 10 or just 5 years ago, for the most part, that's something they don't care about. On the other hand, one of Windows' strengths used to be that Microsoft had an attention to backwards compatibility, and that legacy is carried forward with Proton. But what's critical to understand here is that Proton has discrete versions. Games can be tested against a specific version of Proton and then frozen there. Old versions of Proton will continue to work with modern versions of Linux, delivering rock-solid compatibility for legacy games and applications. It's pretty incredible, honestly. At the end of the day, Proton provides a path forward, a bridge, if you will, from a market dominated by Microsoft's complacent apathy towards Windows, and a future where Linux and Windows coexist as competitors and equals. The question is, though, will there ever come a day where Linux native game clients actually make sense? Sure, absolutely there will be a day. Namely, when there are more Linux-powered desktop PCs that financially justify the added costs to developers. That'll be a great day to see. And when there are more developers with experience making Linux games, even better. Now, there are real concerns that by providing a Windows-like environment in Linux, it disincentivizes developers to learn Linux, or it allows developers to be lazy, or it reinforces Windows' dominance over PC gaming. But each of these concerns are progressively more absurd than the last. The argument against all of those concerns is that if Proton wasn't a thing, then Steam Deck could not exist. Look, Proton alleviates much of the friction for developers who want to make their games available on platforms like the Steam Deck. Essentially, that friction boils down to development time and financial realities. As time passes and market share continues to grow, we'll find developers who want to push the Steam Deck further, and that will eventually necessitate native Linux clients. Further down the road, as SteamOS matures, public sentiment will continue to turn, and will collectively overcome the propagandized stigma around Linux gaming. At some point soon, we will hit critical mass, the financials will work out, and native Linux clients will make an appearance. Now, will there ever be a day where Proton isn't a necessity, though? I don't think so. And while some people may opine that sober reality, I think it should be celebrated that there is a viable, open alternative to the nasty, proprietary, and ever-closing Windows ecosystem. And that thing that should be celebrated is Proton. Now, I am dying to hear your thoughts on this. Leave me a comment below. I really appreciate reading your guys' comments on these things. I know there's going to be a lot of people who disagree with me, and I really want to hear your arguments about why I'm wrong. So leave a comment below. I want to shout out my friends on Patreon, my YouTube members, and our ViewSync premium subscribers who make what we're doing here a reality. If you believe in the work that I'm doing, you can use the links below to support the show as a member on Patreon. It's all greatly appreciated. Thank you. That's going to do it for now, though. Thank you so much for watching and spending your time with me here today, and I'll see you in the next one.